The night before it happened, the island breathed in peace. Palm trees swayed under warm winds. Radios hummed softly in officers' quarters. Couples danced near the beach. The ships at Pearl Harbor, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, rested in the water like giants asleep. It was Sunday, December the 7th, 1941. And across the Pacific, unseen beneath the horizon, death was already flying toward them. The Japanese fleet had sailed in absolute silence. 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 30 submarines. It was the largest carrier strike group in naval history, and it had one purpose: deliver a blow so sharp, so complete, that the United States would stay out of the Pacific War forever. But on the decks of those carriers, there was no triumph, only ritual. Pilots prepared their flight gear. Mechanics checked engines under red lights. Flight crews loaded torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in complete silence. Shinto priests had blessed the squadrons before departure. Some pilots had written final letters home. Some believed they would not return. The code word was simple: Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. A symbol of surprise achieved. Back on Oahu, the air smelled of salt and hibiscus. Sailors played cards. A few drank coffee, still in their bunks. The radar operators at Opana Station picked up an unusual formation coming in from the north. They reported it. Their warning was dismissed. Training exercise, someone said. American intelligence had intercepted enough messages to know that Japan was preparing something, but they expected an attack in the Philippines, or perhaps Thailand, maybe Malaya. No one imagined that the blow would fall at Pearl. No one believed Japan would strike there. At 6:00 a.m., the first wave of planes lifted off the carrier decks. 183 aircraft, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes. Their engines thundered over the Pacific, sunlight bouncing off wingtips painted with the red circles of the rising sun. They flew low, fast, tight formation, under radio silence. At Hickam Field, a few American pilots were just waking up. One would later recall hearing engines and thinking it was nothing. Just training, just noise. He looked out his window, rubbed his eyes, and went back to sleep. At 7:40 a.m., the lead Japanese planes reached the coast. The harbor still slept. A destroyer signaled spotting a periscope in restricted waters. The report was passed on, slowly, bureaucratically. No action taken. 5 minutes later, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, circling high above in his Nakajima B-5N, looked down on Pearl Harbor and saw it all laid out like a painting. Battleships lined up, stationary. Airfields unguarded. No fighters in the air. It was perfect. He keyed his radio. Tora, Tora, Tora. The sky began to scream. The attack had begun. But this part of the story, the burning decks, the bombs falling, the cries of men in oil and flame, that came later. First came silence, a stillness that would never return. And in the Soviet Far East, across the frozen plains near Khabarovsk, a junior intelligence officer monitoring radio intercepts scribbled down a single line in his notebook. Something was happening. Not in Europe, not in the USSR, in the Pacific, in America. It would take hours before Moscow received confirmation. It would take days before the Kremlin understood what it meant. But in that moment, as the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, a new chapter began. Not just in American history, but in the fate of the entire world. The peace that had lingered on the edges of the Pacific was gone. The empire had struck, and the storm had finally arrived. 7:48 a.m. The sky shattered. The first Japanese bombs hit Wheeler Field, north of Pearl Harbor. Barracks exploded in flame. Planes parked wing to wing, lit up like dry kindling. Men were thrown from bunks before they were even awake. 6 minutes later, torpedo planes swept into the harbor itself, skimming just feet above the water. They flew so low, sailors swore they could see the pilot's eyes. The targets were clear. Battleship Row, USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, lined up, stationary, engines off, unaware. One by one, they were struck. A single torpedo ripped open Oklahoma's hull like paper. She capsized within minutes, trapping hundreds below deck. West Virginia took 7 torpedoes and stayed afloat only because of the shallow harbor bottom. Nevada, at the far end of the row, tried to get underway and instantly became a moving target. Then came the bombers. High altitude, slow, deliberate. One dropped a 1,160-pound armor-piercing bomb directly into the forward magazine of USS Arizona. The ship didn't just explode, it erupted. A flash brighter than the sun. A sound so violent, it tore apart nearby windows. The fireball rose higher than the mast. Within 9 minutes, she was gone. More than 1,100 men died instantly, many never found. The harbor water caught fire, slick with oil and blood. Men jumped into it anyway. Some swam through flame. Others drowned with lungs full of fuel. Medics dragged charred bodies from the surf. Nurses worked without gloves, without pause, wrapping tourniquets with trembling hands and sleeves soaked red. It was chaos without language. On Ford Island, gun crews scrambled to reach their stations. Ammunition lockers were locked, keys missing. Chain of command? Gone. Officers dead. Radios jammed. But still, they fought. A single .50 caliber gun crew on Nevada fired non-stop until their barrel glowed orange. A pilot named George Welch, barefoot and half-dressed, sprinted to a surviving P-40 and took off under fire. He and another pilot shot down 4 Japanese aircraft that morning, with no wingman, no backup, no orders. In the skies, the Japanese were machines. 353 aircraft in total, 2 waves, torpedoes, bombs, bullets, 0 fighters swarming like wasps, dive bombers screaming down with precision, honed over months of training. They had rehearsed this moment, in secret bays, on wooden mock-ups, over endless flight drills. Every pilot knew his role, every target was assigned, every minute accounted for, and it worked. By 9 a.m., the harbor was unrecognizable. 8 battleships hit, 4 sunk, 188 American aircraft destroyed on the ground. More than 2,400 Americans dead, sailors, soldiers, airmen, civilians. And still, the Japanese had only lost 29 planes. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, circling overhead, looked down on the burning harbor and radioed back to the fleet. Mission successful. But below, in the smoke and ruin, something else had ignited. Not just fuel, not just ships, but rage. There was no declaration of war, no warning, only fire. In the halls of Washington, the news broke like glass. First disbelief, then horror, then fury. President Roosevelt, reading the early reports, stood in silence. Then he spoke a single word. Infamy. He knew what had happened wasn't just an attack, it was an awakening. And 5,000 miles away, in Moscow, the Soviet General Staff received its own confirmation through diplomatic channels. The Americans had been hit. Hard. The Pacific was no longer an ocean of neutrality. It was now a battlefield. Stalin said little, but his mind moved quickly. If Japan attacked west, toward the USSR, the Red Army would be forced to fight a second front in the Far East. But if Tokyo focused south, toward the Pacific, that freed Soviet hands, freed divisions, freed strategy. America's loss could become the Soviet Union's window, but no one, not Stalin, not Roosevelt, not even Hirohito, yet understood the real consequence of this morning. Because the Japanese had struck a sleeping giant, and in doing so, they had unleashed something even their most hardened admirals feared. An America at war. Pearl Harbor burned, but something else had ignited. Not in Hawaii, but in the American heart. And what followed would reshape not just the Pacific, but the world itself. The sky above Oahu was never meant to look like that. It was supposed to be blue, the calm, endless blue of a tropical morning. But now, it was black and red and choking. Flames reached higher than the palm trees. Smoke curled over the bay in thick columns, turning daylight into dusk. The air tasted like burning oil, scorched metal, and blood. And still, the attack wasn't over. At 8:40 a.m., the second wave came. 171 more Japanese aircraft, dive bombers, high-altitude bombers, fighters, sweeping in from the north, engines growling low like thunder rolling in reverse. They flew through the smoke left by the first wave, guided by fire. The pilots had seen the destruction already done. Arizona gone, Oklahoma capsized, smoke pouring from West Virginia and California, and they pressed on to finish the job. Their orders were brutal. Cripple the fleet, paralyze the air, humiliate the enemy. They struck Hickam Field, Bellows, Ewa, and Wheeler again. Hangars exploded, runways cratered. Men trying to launch surviving planes were gunned down on the tarmac. Barracks still full of sleeping airmen were hit by high explosive ordnance. Fire spread across the base hospitals. Electricity failed. Doctors operated by lantern light. Amputations were performed with field knives. Morphine ran out by noon. Sailors dragged each other from the water. Oil fires on the surface kept burning lungs from breathing. Some ships still fired back, deafening blasts from single surviving guns. The USS Nevada, still afloat, attempted to steam toward the harbor mouth, flames licking her deck, trying to escape into open water. She almost made it. Japanese dive bombers saw her and swarmed. Hit after hit rained down. Her hull cracked. Smoke poured from her bridge. Rather than sink and block the entire channel, her captain made a decision that became legend. Beach her. Fight where she stands. And she did. Listing, burning, still firing. A symbol, not of victory, but of refusal. Across the harbor, scenes repeated in brutal rhythm. Below deck, trapped men banged on steel with wrenches, screaming for torches that wouldn't come in time. Some ships lost power and filled with smoke. Others flooded from below, rising cold water cutting men off from ladders and exits. Some climbed through air shafts. Others never had the chance. Survivors would later speak of a silence, not during, but after. A moment when the noise stopped. Engines gone. Gunfire over. Just the crackle of flame, the creak of metal, the cries of the wounded, and the dead, floating in oil-black water. More than 2,000 would not rise again. And yet, even as destruction rained down, acts of defiance and courage emerged like sparks in the dark. A chaplain stood among the wounded aboard the Oklahoma, reciting prayers over men dying in fire. On Utah, a cook dragged 4 sailors through a flooding corridor, kicking down a jammed hatch with his bare feet. At Ford Island, an 18-year-old Marine manned a machine gun for over an hour, refusing morphine even after shrapnel had torn through his side. No one had trained them for this, but they fought anyway. The Japanese pilots, returning to their carriers, reported success. Their losses were light. The fleet had not been detected. Surprise had been total. Mission accomplished. But one officer, Commander Minoru Genda, watched the horizon darken behind them and wondered aloud, "We have awakened something we cannot yet see." He was right, because beneath the flames, beneath the smoke, beneath the twisted steel, something deeper had caught fire. Resolve. America was wounded, but not broken. The ships burned, yes, but some would be raised, repaired, returned. The dead were gone, but the living would remember. And the enemy, for all its precision, had missed one crucial target. The American carriers, the Lexington, the Enterprise, the Saratoga, all at sea that morning, untouched, alive. And they would come back with vengeance in their bomb bays. In Moscow, the first full reports began arriving on Stalin's desk. The numbers stunned his staff. 8 battleships hit, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, thousands dead, all in under 2 hours. He read the names of the ships like they were fallen generals: Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California. He said nothing, but his mind moved again. This attack was more than tactical. It was symbolic. The United States had been neutral, hesitant, distant. Now, it was at war. The Japanese had lit a fire in the Pacific, and the world, the entire world, was about to burn. High above the Pacific, as the sun rose behind them, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy looked down upon history and helped rewrite it with every passing second. They were not kamikaze, not fanatics, not yet. They were trained men, skilled, disciplined, precise. Many had flown combat over China. Others had tested their nerves in bombing runs over Nanking, Chongqing, and British outposts in Southeast Asia. They were not naive about what they were about to do, but they believed in it. To them, this was not murder. It was sacrifice, offered on the altar of empire. The lead pilot of the first wave, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, carried no illusions. His job was to coordinate an airstrike of unprecedented scale. 183 aircraft flying in tight formation across 230 miles of open ocean, under radio silence, at low altitude, against the most powerful naval base in the Pacific. Fuchida had rehearsed the strike for weeks. His pilots drilled formation flying until it felt like breathing. He knew where every American ship should be, which targets mattered most, and how long they had before American anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into metal shrapnel. But he didn't expect such stillness. From his cockpit window, Fuchida saw the harbor as he'd studied it on maps, but quieter. No scrambling aircraft, no flak, no alarm, just battleships sleeping. He keyed the transmitter and sent the code. Tora, Tora, Tora. Surprise achieved, and then they dove. Torpedo planes, their bellies heavy with warheads, swooped down to within feet of the water, lining up for perfect runs. The bombers came in staggered. Dive bombers screamed through the clouds, releasing payloads over ships that hadn't even powered their engines. And the Zeros, the agile, deadly Mitsubishi A6Ms, fanned out across the skies, strafing airfields, towers, hangars, and anyone who moved. Each pilot had a target. Each second counted. Each round fired brought them closer to the edge of glory, or death. Inside one of those cockpits was Ensign Takeshi Maeda, 23 years old, his gloved hands tight on the stick of his Zero. His orders were simple: sweep the southern edge of Ford Island, neutralize any defensive emplacements, and protect the bombers from interception. He had joined the Navy to serve the Emperor. He had trained to fly in formation, to kill quickly, to die cleanly if ordered. But as he passed low over the harbor and saw flames rising from the Arizona, Maeda felt something strange. Not pride, not fear. Awe. He had never seen so much fire, never heard so much screaming metal. Ships tilted like wounded animals. Planes exploded before they could leave the ground. American sailors, shocked, barefoot, bleeding, returned fire with rifles, pistols, anything they had. He kept flying, pulled into a climb, banked left, found another target. The rules were clear. Do not attack civilian areas. Do not target hospitals. Do not waste fuel. But war, once unleashed, obeys no rulebook. Maeda's squadron lost 2 men on the first pass. Another was hit by flak and ditched in the ocean. His radio crackled with reports: successful hits, enemy resistance, orders to regroup. It was working, but it wasn't clean. In every cockpit, there was the same duality: discipline and doubt. They had been told that America, once struck, would sue for peace, that the loss of its Pacific fleet would buy Japan time, 6 months, maybe a year, to seize territory, secure resources, and fortify islands from Indonesia to Midway. They had been told the enemy was soft, indecisive, afraid of blood. But what they saw in the fire was something else: defiance. Men firing back, ships still moving. A harbor not just screaming, but fighting. Fuchida, orbiting above, saw Nevada trying to steam toward the harbor mouth, burning but alive. He saw gunners still firing from decks slick with oil. He noted it, admired it, and worried. Because he knew what he had unleashed was not victory, it was war. When the first wave returned to the carriers, many pilots were euphoric. They laughed, slapped each other on the back, spoke of clean hits and fireballs. Others sat silently. Some stared at their flight gloves, still shaking. One, a 21-year-old torpedo pilot, asked softly, "Did we hit too hard?" He was told not to ask again. By nightfall, all 353 planes had returned or been accounted for. The Japanese fleet turned east, into the Pacific fog. The sailors aboard the carrier celebrated. Officers toasted success. Tokyo radio announced a great triumph. But Fuchida did not celebrate. And neither did the senior admiral, Isoroku Yamamoto, far away in his headquarters in Japan. He had approved the plan, planned much of it himself. But when the telegram arrived confirming the scale of destruction, he said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, to no one in particular, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." In the Kremlin, there were no sirens, no flames, no screaming metal, no bombs falling from the sky, just silence, and the quiet scratching of pens across paper as Soviet intelligence officers decoded the impossible. America had been attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. At first, the reports were fragments, intercepts, unconfirmed chatter from diplomatic cables and radio traffic. Then came the message from the Soviet embassy in Washington: massive airstrike by Japanese forces on U.S. Pacific Fleet. Heavy damage, casualties unknown. Stalin read the note, then read it again. He didn't speak. His generals stood by, waiting for orders, questions, anything. None came, because Stalin didn't yet know if this was a distraction or an opportunity. The Soviet Union, by December 1941, was fighting for its life. Operation Barbarossa had pushed to the very gates of Moscow. The Wehrmacht had surrounded Leningrad, ravaged Ukraine, captured hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers in sweeping encirclements. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The Soviet Far East, meanwhile, was garrisoned by more than 400,000 troops, not because of Germany, but because of Japan. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed in April 1941, had kept the eastern border quiet. But no one trusted it. Japan had attacked Russia before, in 1904 at Port Arthur, in 1939 at Khalkhin Gol. Stalin remembered both. Now, this strike on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Because if Japan had turned south, toward the US and British colonies, and not north toward Siberia, that meant something vital. The Soviet Union could breathe again. And so, quietly, methodically, Stalin's staff went to work. Within hours, they ordered the redeployment of 18 Siberian divisions westward. These were some of the best trained, best equipped soldiers in the Red Army. hardened by Arctic winters and mountain warfare. They came with skis, white camouflage, and discipline forged in ice. They would arrive just in time for the counteroffensive outside Moscow, the first time the Red Army would stop, then push back the Nazis. America didn't know it yet, but its suffering at Pearl Harbor had just saved the Soviet capital. Meanwhile, inside Soviet intelligence headquarters on Lubyanka Street, the analysts dissected every broadcast coming out of Tokyo and Washington. One report stood out. President Roosevelt would address Congress the next day. The speech would likely be a declaration of war. That was good. Soviet diplomats in Washington confirmed that Roosevelt was furious, not just about the attack, but about Japan's lack of warning. He reportedly called it a knife in the back. Even better, because Stalin didn't want America hesitant. He wanted it angry. For the past 2 years, the USSR had begged the Allies to open a second front, to send weapons, planes, trucks, radios, anything. Now, with America officially at war, Lend-Lease support would skyrocket. Soviet officers were already drafting lists. They wanted Studebaker trucks, Hurricane fighters, machine tools, radios, aluminum, boots. They would get all of it, and more. But Stalin was no romantic. He understood what Pearl Harbor also meant. It meant the Pacific would now be a battlefield, that the United States, with its vast industrial power, would turn its gaze westward and begin projecting force across oceans. And Stalin didn't like unpredictability, because American power, once fully awakened, was hard to predict, harder to control. Still, he smiled. For now, Japan had given him a gift. For now, the Red Army would have room to fight. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats sent urgent messages to Moscow. They insisted the neutrality pact still stood, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a strike against imperialism, not communism, that the Soviet Union had nothing to fear. Stalin played along. He met with Japanese Ambassador Otani, listened carefully, offered no opinion, expressed regret at the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and the US, and said nothing of the trains now rolling westward, filled with Siberian troops. In the Politburo, some hawks urged Stalin to break the neutrality pact and strike Japan while it was distracted. He refused. "Let the Americans bleed them," he said. It was cold logic, ruthless, effective. Why fight a two-front war when one front was collapsing under snow and fire, and the other was now America's problem? So Moscow listened. They monitored American radio broadcasts, pored over intercepted messages, watched Japanese troop movements from Manchuria to the Philippines, and they waited. Because Stalin knew the war had changed shape, not ended, not even slowed, but shifted. And in that shift was survival. The bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor sent shockwaves across oceans and continents. In Hawaii, they sank ships. In Moscow, they saved a nation. December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor was still burning. The sun rose over a blackened coastline. Battleship Row was now a graveyard of twisted steel and scorched decks. The water, once clear, was thick with oil and ash. Divers searched the wreckage for bodies that would never be recovered. Survivors walked in silence, past floating helmets, torn life jackets, and lifeboats drifting without owners. The air smelled like fuel and death. But across the Pacific, and across America, something far more powerful had begun to stir. In Washington, D.C., the capital was already full before sunrise. Journalists, generals, diplomats, and aides packed the galleries. Security was tight, but the mood was electric. Not fearful, not shaken, but unified in a way that few had ever felt. At exactly 12:30 p.m., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the chamber. He wore a black armband. He did not smile. He placed his prepared statement on the lectern, adjusted his glasses, and began. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The room went silent. Outside, millions of radios carried his voice across the country. Farmers in Kansas stopped tractors to listen. Dock workers in New York gathered around shipping crates. Teachers turned on classroom radios. Housewives stood in kitchens, dishes forgotten in the sink. Roosevelt's voice was steady, cold, controlled. He outlined the attack with precision. The surprise, the treachery, the lives lost. And then, he asked for war. I asked that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote took 6 minutes. The result? 388 to 1. Only one representative, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted no. She had voted against World War I too. She was booed as she left the chamber. The rest of America was already preparing for the fight ahead. Recruitment stations saw lines stretching down city blocks. Men who had never held a rifle begged to be sent west. Women flooded factories, volunteering to build shells, assemble radios, sew uniforms. The war had arrived, and no one was waiting. Back at Pearl Harbor, the scale of the loss was becoming clear. USS Arizona, destroyed. Over 1 to 100 dead, still burning below the waves. USS Oklahoma, capsized. Hundreds drowned inside. USS West Virginia, California, Nevada, Utah, damaged or sunk. In total, 21 ships had been hit, 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans were dead. The youngest was just 17. The oldest was 63. Some were killed in their bunks. Others died at their posts. A few, like Dory Miller, the black cook who manned an anti-aircraft gun without training, had become instant heroes. And yet, even amidst the devastation, the harbor did not fall silent. Repair crews were already at work. Fires still smoldered, but cranes moved. Divers welded. Engines restarted. A junior officer aboard the Maryland, when asked if they were abandoning the harbor, replied simply, "Hell no, we're staying, and we're getting ready." In San Diego and San Francisco, shipyards lit up overnight. On the East Coast, factories retooled for war. The isolationist voices that had dominated American debate for years fell quiet. Pearl Harbor had made the choice for them. But while America was reeling, Japan was celebrating. In Tokyo, newspapers hailed the success. Citizens cheered in the streets. Children waved flags. Emperor Hirohito, distant and reserved, offered no public comment, but the military elite basked in glory. Admiral Yamamoto, however, said nothing. His staff toasted the attack as a masterpiece. He stared at the map. He knew Pearl Harbor had been a tactical victory, but the war would not be won by surprise attacks. Not when America had awakened. Not when its people were now unified in rage. Because Yamamoto had studied in the United States. He had walked its cities, met its admirals, watched its factories. He knew what America could do, once it committed. And now, it had. In Moscow, Stalin received confirmation that war had been declared. His staff celebrated quietly. This would ease pressure on the Eastern Front. This would flood the Red Army with weapons and trucks and food. This would drag Hitler's ally into a new quagmire. And that would buy the USSR time. But even Stalin sensed it. This was the true beginning. The world had been at war before. But now, with America fully engaged, it had become something larger, something faster, something irreversible. A global fire. And Pearl Harbor was the match. The ships were still sinking when the war machine began to rise. Across the American heartland, steel mills fired up. In Detroit, car factories halted production and retooled overnight. Tanks would now roll off the lines instead of sedans. In Pittsburgh, molten metal poured into new molds. Bullets, helmets, armor plates. In Washington, military planners drew new maps. The Pacific had become a war zone. But this would not be a war of attrition, not for America. It would be a war of industry, of scale, of momentum. And the American arsenal, once slow to stir, was now roaring awake. Pearl Harbor was the wound. Now came the response. Carriers that had escaped the Japanese attack, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, became the tip of the spear. Within weeks, they were striking back. Not with overwhelming force, not yet, but with intent. Bombing raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, submarines prowling Japanese shipping lanes. The message was clear. You hit us, we are coming. But that was only the beginning. Roosevelt didn't want revenge, he wanted victory. And so, the scale changed. Within 6 months, the U.S. Navy would launch the Doolittle raid. B-25 bombers launched from the deck of a carrier, striking Tokyo itself. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact? Tremendous. Japan was not untouchable. The American hand could now reach across the ocean. The sleeping giant had not only awakened, it was learning to strike back. And then came Midway. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet returned to finish what it started. But this time, the Americans were ready. Intelligence, code-breaking, and raw courage converged in one of the most decisive naval battles in history. 4 Japanese carriers, the same ones that had launched the attack on Pearl, were sunk in a single day. The tide had turned. From then on, Japan was on the defensive. Island by island, reef by reef, the U.S. forces moved west. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle bloodier than the last, each one bringing the war closer to Tokyo. Pearl Harbor had lit the fire. but it was American resolve that kept it burning. Back home, women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon. War bonds funded the effort. Rationing became routine. Children collected scrap metal. The entire nation bent toward a single goal: win. And they would. Because while Japan had trained its pilots for years, America built thousands of planes each month. While Japan crafted precision ships by hand, America launched Liberty ships in weeks. While Japanese strategy relied on boldness, American strategy relied on scale. And the scale was unmatched. In Tokyo, what had begun as triumph became dread. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was shot down by American P-38 fighters in 1943. His death was symbolic. The man who had feared America's awakening did not live to see the end he predicted. But it came anyway. In August 1945, after island had been taken at tremendous cost, and after the horrifying bloodshed of Okinawa, the U.S. unveiled its final answer. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 cities, 2 bombs, hundreds of thousands of lives extinguished in seconds. The war that had begun at Pearl Harbor ended in atomic fire. On September 2, 1945, aboard the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered. American sailors stood where Japanese admirals had once toasted victory. The empire had fallen. And in the crowd of officers and officials stood men who had survived Pearl Harbor. They had seen their ships sink. Now, they saw their country rise. In the Soviet Union, Stalin watched closely. The American display of power was not just about defeating Japan. It was a signal. The post-war world would be shaped not only by bullets and tanks, but by technology, industry, and fear. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. It pulled America into the war, and then pushed it to the center of the world stage. It forged alliances, transformed economies, accelerated science, and redrew the global map. But its greatest legacy was not in bombs or treaties. It was in the men who fought back, and the nation that chose not to fall. Pearl Harbor was not just a day of infamy. It was the day the world shifted. The day America stopped watching and started fighting. The day history caught fire.